and welcome. We are so glad to have you participating in our first event in this series on self-governing cities. This event is part of the Charter Cities Atlas online experience. My name is Katarina Serlet. I am the CEO of the Adrianople Group. We are a business advisory and research firm with a primary focus on special economic zones, private and master plan cities, and community infrastructure in emerging markets. For over a year now, we have been quietly building a beautiful atlas to tell the history of self-determination in over a dozen cities, how they flourished by governing themselves. You can visit the project at thechartercitiesatlas.com to explore each city as an interactive chapter. We have already received a lot of wonderful feedback on the project, and I'm so excited to share it with you today through this forum and our 3 presentations. This project is a collaboration between the Adrianople Group and the Charter Cities Institute.
The Charter Cities Institute, if you guys aren't familiar, for those that are hearing about them for the first time, they're really the premier think tank building the ecosystem for charter cities globally. They just opened up their new office in Zambia. Heba will be one of our speakers today, joining us from Zambia. We're really glad to have her and really excited to get the show started today. So we'll be having 3 talks. The research director from the Adrianople Group, my husband Thibault Serlet, Jorge Colindres from Inertia, and I will hand it over to my colleague Ivette Cano to really dig in a little bit deeper. So thanks everybody for joining. We're so excited to have you all.
Thanks, Kat. We're really excited to get started. Thanks everybody for joining to our first event, the Charter Cities Atlas, Exploring Self-Governing Cities. So before we get it started, we want to talk a little bit about this project itself, the Charter Cities Atlas. So this is a project that began with the idea to sort of demystify charter cities and to exemplify that charter cities are not a novel notion. Because most of them, and the truth is that independent city-states are the most ancient form of social organization. Their disappearance in the 16th century is more of a recent and modern phenomenon. And now that we see with the movement that there's a re-emergence of charter cities, studying this passive city-state has become more important than ever. So we wanted to address many questions and concerns with this project. We wanted to talk about how did our ancestor deals with problems such as communal organization, how has governance changed through time, and how have the laws evolved alongside the nation state? How has trade changed, and how will the future affect our past? So with the Charter Cities Atlas, this is a project that looks at the story of 13 different cities in a new light, telling a different narrative of resilience and power that highlights the people's will to govern their own cities and shape the futures. By looking at these different cities through the lens of governance, we can learn more about why cities are the way they are today. And we hope that you all had the chance to explore already the Charter Cities Atlas, because this is a project that has been crafted with much consideration, passion, and care. We have had many restless nights, infinite number of meetings, trying to address how can we make this in a way that's interesting and that really captures all this curiosity that got us involved in the first place. So if you haven't already, we will be sharing the link in this group chat. So you can also read the first chapter, which is Tangier, the disputed territory that became the literature capital of the Mediterranean. And we will be releasing our second chapter very much soon. And now, another way to support this project is by checking our new NFT collection that just launched, where DC artist Super Dope Art, also known as Nathan Silver, has created a stunning piece for this project itself, for the Charter Cities Atlas. And it features a man sitting next to an archway in Medina Tangier. Nathan will be creating 13 unique pieces of art for the Atlas collection as part of this project. He has done a lot of research and dedicated many, many hours to trying to envision what the city looked like in this time period that we're discussing in this project, and then just creating a unique piece that captures the ambience, the atmosphere, and the sort of energy and vibrance that city had at that time period. So they're very carefully crafted, and each piece will depict life in a self-governing city from across the world in different historical periods. The Atlas itself highlights lessons that can be learned from each of the cities to create prosperous cities of the future. But this is not just an NFT. we're thinking more of this more in a way to promote this sort of historical art, because you will be owning the original physical and hand-drawn version of the art piece, as well as a time lapse of its creation, so you can admire it from start to finish. And if you do buy it, the physical artwork can be delivered or picked at the main offices on the Charter Cities Institute in Washington, D.C. So we will be sharing the link as well of the NFT in an OpenSea, so you can take a look and see for yourself if you want this little piece of history. Now, about what brought us here. Today, we're having three amazing speakers and three amazing different lectures. We're going to be talking about pre-colonial African city-states with Heba Elhanafy. We're going to be talking about the Hispanic heritage of free cities by Jorge Colindres. And we're going to be talking as well, why does medieval maps don't have borders by Thibault Serlet. And each one of them is focused on a different region and a different time period, but all of them with the goal of exploring further this fascinating notion of self-governing cities. Now, before giving the microphone to our first speaker, I would like to introduce you to her. Our first speaker is Heba Elhanafy, who is an urban planner, researcher, and developer. Her research interests lie in human settlements, culture, heritage, community, and urban development. She has a bachelor's degree in architecture and urban planning from Alexandria University and a master's degrees in urban development from the Technical University of Berlin. She has worked on a variety of urban development and research projects with regional and international organizations. Originally from Egypt, Heba had joined the Charter Cities Institute as a member of the Atlas Corp Fellowship, and she's now in the brand new Charter Cities Institute office in Zambia. So, Heba, now is your time to tell us a little bit more about this fascinating topic of pre-colonial African city-states. We can't wait to hear you.
Thank you so much, Ivette, and I will be sharing my screen. Please let me know if you guys can see it. All good? Okay, so yes, as Ivette mentioned, my name is Heba, and I'm currently have been relocated from our offices in DC to our brand new offices here in Osaka. So if this research interests you, if anything that we're doing right now at CCI interests you, please come pay us a visit. We have coffee, and I make sure that we always have fresh fruit in the office. Without further ado, I'll be talking about pre-colonial African city-states. In my talk today, I'm going to have like three parts. The first part is why. I'm going to try to discuss with you why did I start this research, where it came from, my motivations. Of course, I understand that everyone is here for different reasons and have their own reasons, but I thought it would be cool to share mine with you guys. The second thing is I'm going to give 4 examples of really brilliant pre-colonial African city-states. And then we're just going to take 2 minutes or 3 minutes or even more to just reflect on everything that I said. Just to clarify, when did I start this research? I started this research on a blog series with our operation manager, Emmanuel. Hi, Emmanuel. So if any of the things that I'm saying interests you, make sure you go to chartercitiesinstitute.org/blogs, and you're going to find all of the blogs, and you can know more about it in details. And why the blog series is also like really important to the conversation today, because this was the first like thing that kind of inspired the city atlas, the reason we're all here today. So after we wrote and explored a little bit about the city-states in pre-colonial Africa, we thought, hey, why not we explore city-states and different forms of governance throughout history all over the world. We're very grateful that you guys are interested in the city atlas, and we hope you continue this journey with us, because it's gonna, expand around a couple of months, but it's gonna be a really cool journey. Okay, so let's start with the first thing that we're going to talk about, which is the why. I have 3 reasons why I started this research, and the first one, and for me it's like the most important, and if you don't take anything from what I'm going to say today except this, that's it. City-states are the cornerstone of urban development in pre-colonial Africa. Let me say it one more time. City-states are the cornerstone of urban development in pre-colonial Africa. So I can't be talking about urban development. I can't be talking about cities. I can't be talking about human settlements in pre-colonial Africa or in even current Africa without talking about the city-states. So it's very important to know the history of the city-states, to actually know the history of urban development. And I would actually take it up a notch and say the city-states are not just the cornerstone of urban development in pre-colonial Africa, they are the cornerstone of development, period, in pre-colonial Africa. And as I'm going to discuss more the examples that I'm going to share with you, we're going to understand how the city-state actually helped development in Africa. The second reason is that I always say that cities are civilizations. The human activities that happen within cities, the economic exchange, the political hierarchies are civilizations. And since we just established that the city-states are the cornerstone of pre-colonial urban development in pre-colonial Africa, ignoring the history of the city-states is basically ignoring a huge part of the civilization of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa in pre-colonization lived in very organized hierarchies and in very organized societies, and this is what we try to explore in this talk. The third thing, which is also another really important reason, is Africa's urban future. By the end of this decade, we're going to be more than 60% urban in the continent. We already face a lot of issues in our urbanization, and I expect through this decade and even the coming decade, we're going to have even more problems. And unless we take a look back at how we created really awesome city, how we govern them, how we grow them over the years, we're not going to be able to create our urban futures, and we're not going to be able to actually sustain the thing that we have. So now that I'm done with the reasons, I'm going to go through part two, which are the examples. And please share with me your reasons of why you're interested in this talk or you're interested in this research. Maybe I'll learn something new. Okay, so let's start with Kumasi, and this example is actually really cool because this is a very strong example, okay? So this is a settlement that started as a tributary state to the Dinkiria Kingdom, and they were on the trans-Saharan trade routes. So they started becoming stronger and stronger every day, and they were looking at the small villages, small towns around them, and they started capturing one town, started capturing another village, another settlement, and they were like, you know what, we're pretty strong right now. So they declared themselves a city-state, and they were like, you know what, let's also annex the Dinkiria Kingdom. They annexed the Dinkiria Kingdom, and they started their own empire, which is one of the strongest empires in sub-Saharan Africa till this day. At their highest, they ruled over 250,000 square kilometers and over 3 million people. And they had one of the more complex governance systems. They had different ways of reporting to on a state level and on very lower levels. And they didn't just treat it with other sub-Saharan countries or with other African settlements. They actually traded a lot with the British. And that's why I say this example is really strong, because actually the British tried to annex them 5 times over a 50-year period. Some would say even over a 100-year period. The British tried to annex them, keep failing until they finally got annexed in 1874. They traded a lot with the British, and they were smart enough to acquire a lot of gunpowder and a lot of arms with the British, and it took them, as I said, tens and tens of years to actually annex this great empire. The effect of this empire can still be seen and can still be recognized in the actual constitution of Ghana, which is the monarchical rule still kind of exists. If we go to another example, which is Kilwa, and I particularly enjoy Kilwa because I'm not going to start talking about Kilwa. I'm going to start talking about everything around Kilwa. I probably should have used a better map than this, but if we can see here, this is Kilwa, and you can see a lot of points and a lot of names around it. So this is Kilwa coexisting or existing with many other city-states on the East African coast. If we look at every single city-state and how they existed, we realize that every single city-state, they controlled a different economic route. all of them, they traded with practically everyone in the Indian Ocean. They traded with the Arabs, they traded with the Chinese, they traded with the Persians and the Indians, and they formed this like one culture, the Swahili culture. And what's really interesting about this example is that all of the cities, although they kind of had the same culture, traded with the same people, were in slight healthy competition with each other over the things that they traded. They never really at any point developed into one unified kingdom. We saw in the last example how Kumasi turned into this great empire, but for the most part, so city-states just stayed there, prosperous, trading, having the same culture, just coexisting peacefully. And we mention here Kilwa because Kilwa is one of the bigger city-states. They basically controlled the Zimbabwean gold mines and exported them, as we said, to other places. And all of the city states, they worked really well in connecting the interior of Africa to the rest of the world through the Indian Ocean. And of course, the effect of, at a certain point, the Portuguese were like, oh, this is too good, let's go there. So they went there, and then the Omani rulers tried to take it away from them, and then it ended up being a German East Africa colony. Of course, the effect of this great city-state is the Swahili culture that is still pretty dominant in all of the city-states, and you can go and see them. Now we go to a very interesting and one of the oldest actually formations of city-states, which is Cano. So Cano, of course, as every other settlement started as hunter-gatherer community, and by the 10th century, they they moved into Moderator rulership, and they maintained sort of a city-state, already had their autonomy since the 10th century up till now, where they are city-states within the country of Nigeria. And the accomplishments of Kano can still be seen, and the history of Kano can still be seen in the world of Kano. They still have one of the biggest markets in West Africa. Their agricultural industry are very persistent and have a lot of the old ways that are still happening. Of course, the British came in 1903, and we can still see the effect of this great city-state in the fact that it's somewhat still a city-state. The Emir of Kano, which has been there for literally over the 10th century. I mean, different Emirs, but like the same position. And of course, we cannot mention North Nigeria without mentioning a little bit the South. So if we talk about Echo, which is Lagos, Echo had a very interesting story, right? They were this agriculture and fishing communities in what current day Lagos is, but they didn't really have a strong political formation. So when the Benin kingdom annexed them, they had two choices, right? The first choice was to completely control them, control their economies, control everything. Or the other choice is to have some sort of affiliation with them, or have some sort of control, but also give them some control in other aspects. And they went with the second choice, right? So they appointed the Oba of Lagos, which actually still exists to this day, but let them do whatever they want with their economies. And the more I read about Lagos, or more I read about Echo, it was really interesting because they solved one of the problems that we're still having till now. They had a huge urban agriculture process that created surplus. So they were completely 100% dependent on their own food, which is something that we still suffer from in our cities. They had, of course, a huge cross-Atlantic ocean trade. And as all the other stories, the British came in 1851, and you can see the effect of the states in the fact that it's still a state. The Oba of Lagos still remains and still pays tribute to the Oba of Benin. Last, we're gonna do some reflections on all of those really interesting cities. So if we look at Kumasi, we see a typical tale of a city-state turned empire. We can see this kind of examples all over history, all over the world, how city-states eventually turned into kingdom and turned into more complex forms of government and turned into nations. While Kilwa, as we talked about, was this like kind of confederation of city-states that kind of coexisted and together. And this kind of reminds me a little bit with the Hispanic League in Europe. Not quite, but kind of the same. In Cano, we can see the legacy of city-state that persisted over 10 centuries and still kind of exists till this day. We can see this kind of persistence of legacy of city-states and also the North versus South Italian cities. We can see it also in places like Venice or places like Florence, which had a strong legacy of being a city-state. And the last thing with Lagos, it's different ways to autonomy. Yes, it didn't have complete political autonomy, but it did have autonomy over its culture, over its economics, which actually helped us see grew a lot. And it reminded me kind of with the struggles and everything that's going on in Hong Kong. So those are my kind of one reflection and one kind of thing I would like, if you guys are really interested in this, first of all, as I said, go read the blog post. It has so much details. Go watch, see everything that we publish on the CC Atlas. Of course, it has even more details and it looks cooler than the blog post. And two other things that I would say, like, watch them is the History of Africa with Zainab Badawi. Is a BBC documentary that's actually, you can find it on YouTube very easily. When I was initially doing the research for the blog post, I ran across episode 11, which is for city-states and civilization. And when I was trying to create the blog post, my main idea was trying to say, hey, city-states are important, and they're not talked about enough, and they are at the heart of the story of civilization of pre-colonial Africa. And basically, this episode was saying exactly the same, and it's just like a 1 hour episode, so it's a very interesting kind of a take on those cities. And a lot of the examples that I'm using here also are found in this 1 hour documentary. But yeah, watch the whole documentary. It's really nice, really interesting. The other thing is this book that we read in the CCI book club. I just finished a couple of days ago. It's called Born in Blackness, and it's trying to explore the history of how Africans contributed into making the new world, into making the Americans, into creating the modernization that we live in. And what was really interesting for me in the book as well is that, like, while it's telling the story of this civilization of Africa, it's actually telling the story of city-states, telling the stories of cities, it's telling the stories of urban development. So at the core, again, of the story of development of Africa comes to city-states. And it's generally a really cool book that explores a lot of things. I made any questions slide, but I realize the questions are going to be packed and in the end. So please, if you have any questions, send them here, and we're going to answer them as much as we can in the end. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to share my screen now.
Thank you so much, Heba. I think that was quite interesting. Great way to kick it off. I know there's quite a couple of conversations already happening on the Zoom chat, so I encourage you all to continue it, to share resources that you have, to if you have answers to maybe some of the questions that are being asked, you can also feel free to answer them. We want to stimulate this conversation. We will be addressing all of the questions at the end for all three of the different lectures. So just keep the questions flowing. If you have maybe some questions that relate to also previous lectures, if you have general questions that relates to all three of these speakers, you can also send them. If you have basically any sort of questions that you have, feel free to send them because we love that curiosity. So now, moving on to our second lecture, we're going to be hearing about the Hispanic heritage of free cities by Jorge Colindres. And let me tell you a little bit about Jorge before I hand him over the space. Jorge, also known as George, is a lawyer, a business consultant, and a public policy analyst. He has experience advising local and regional business groups in the design and implementation of their corporate governance systems, international tax planning, strategic acquisition, regulatory compliance, and asset protection strategies. He has been the author and co-author of several studies on economic freedom, tax reform, energy market liberalization, special economic zones, constitutional law, and civil liberties. He most recently authored The Honduran Sede, From National Politics to Local Democracies, which was featured on the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. And I also know for a fact that George is a big enthusiast of city-states, charter cities, and self-governing cities. So George, we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us about this Hispanic heritage.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to share with you what I think is one of the most interesting stories of constitutional development in the Western civilization. And this is the Spanish municipal regime, which uh, was described also as the first instance of democracy in Latin America. This is how Juan Bautista Alberdi described it. Juan Bautista Alberdi, he was a constitutional scholar of the 19th century. He's known as the father of the Argentinian constitution. And he said that the Spanish municipal regime has been the first form, the first degree of existence of representative power in Latin American nations, as it has been in Spain itself. Alberti claimed that subsequent centralization efforts could never destroy the germ of freedom and local independence deposited in the customs of the Spanish peoples by the ancient institutions of municipal freedom. So in when we talk about the Latin American municipal regime, which was adopted by the 1500s as a way to to uh, for the conquest to establish itself in America, the Spanish conquest. But it was a direct transplant of the old Spanish municipality. So when the Spanish came to America and they started, the conquest, they used the municipal regime in a way that was similar as it had been used by the Romans during their conquests, and that was the first unit of organization in America. But before, in the colonial era, for the Spanish, I mean. So let me give you some context before that. In the 700s, like there was a Muslim conquest of most of the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal is. It was the Umayyad Caliphate. They conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, and several Spanish kingdoms. They started to fight. There were several wars. It was a period of almost 780 years of combat and between Spanish kingdoms and peoples and the Muslim caliphates. So as the Spanish, there's a period called the Reconquista. That's the reconquest, in which the Spanish recovered a lot of the Iberian Peninsula that had been taken over by the Muslims. So they wanted to, as a security measure, they wanted to repopulate those areas. So these are areas of combat. There had been a war, and of course the Spanish took them back. But then what you have is a former war zone. So the Spanish, to prevent future invasions, they wanted to repopulate the area, and to encourage migratory movements. Then the crown granted these various areas with, they call it letters of freedom, or cartas de libertad, y franquicias, or letters of freedom and franchises, um, or they had various names. They were also known as Cartas Puebla. Cartas Puebla. It translates roughly to people's charter, or town charter. And the other one is Fueros Municipales, which essentially is a city charter. So with these charters, the king tried to incentivize migratory movements into those areas, and thus the charter, what they did is they granted all sorts of privileges, all sorts of autonomy, all sorts of rights that did not exist in the rest of the Spanish kingdom. And that's how the free cities were born, because they wanted to incentivize these migratory movements. Among the benefits is that the people who lived in these cities with their own charter, they were exempt from the power of the nobles. That's the feudal lords. So the nobility, they could not exert their traditional prerogatives against the people that lived within the city. Um, so they were free from serfdom. They were also free from taxes and the general jurisdiction and legislation of the kingdom. So yeah, essentially the taxes that applied in the rest of the kingdom did not apply in these free cities. The legislation that applied in the rest of the kingdom did not apply in these free cities. And they also had their own, well, I'll go into further detail of their governance system further, but they had their own judiciary and their own, their own governments. So these forums or charters, they were sort of covenants. They took the form of a pact. So it was sort of a contract between the king and the city or the people living there, the subjects of the king. This among the oldest ones, just to mention a few, is the city of Leon. This is year 1020. There's Jaca, year 1064, Toledo, Burgos, Zaragoza. All of these were cities that were granted their own charter. And what was most interesting about this charter is that the inhabitants of these municipal jurisdictions, they govern themselves by means of the open council. So essentially, the open council is a popular assembly where all the neighbors voted to make the decisions of collective interest. So essentially, it was very democratic in a sense. I mean, that was the ideal. In practice, there were a lot of restrictions of who could participate and who could not participate. But in general, and to a very important degree for that period of time, the neighbors, they could vote on the decisions. That's how decisions were made. That was called the Open Council. And then, in parallel, they created a closed council, which was like the standing municipal governments. The closed council, the neighbors would vote for the members of the closed council. The closed council was essentially a judge, a mayor, jurors, notary public, and I believe some sort of accountants that kept the accounting of public matters. So so this municipal autonomy would lead to its own legislation. Like these municipalities, they had their own commercial legislation, civil, criminal, procedural. So it was a very broad legislative autonomy that they were enjoying. And the resurgence of these municipalities had a direct, well, it created privileged centers, right, of economic activity and of public exercise of public liberty, to such a degree that it even created a sort of jurisdiction competition between jurisdictions, or yeah, and which caused that the people all over the kingdom, they wanted to flee to the free cities of Spain, because in among other things, they were exempt from serfdom. So if you went to one of these cities and you stayed there for more than a year, then you became a citizen, and you were exempt from the feudal lord. And the feudal lord, they had a lot of prerogatives. There's famous prerogatives called los malos usos, which is the bad uses, which essentially gives them a lot of rights to mistreat, the vassals or the serfs. The most controversial one was it's called Jus Prima Noctis, or which is the right of the first night, which basically meant that the nobility, or the feudal lord, he had to be given notice of any wedding within his territory, and then he would have the right to a night with a bride, before her fiance. So that was like super scandalous. And so of course everybody wanted to flee, and they started going into the free cities. And it was pretty good. Life was pretty good. Economic activity, was great. This became great centers of culture and commerce. Um, some authors even argued that the institution of the Spanish Free City, being prior to the Magna Carta of England, could be considered as the most remote Western antecedent of classical constitutionalism and public liberties. Um, because it was this was way a couple of perhaps 200 years before the Magna Carta. And one of the examples that are placed of to the level of rights or of legal culture that developed in these centers is the oath of the subjects of the King of Aragon. So there was an oath, and the oath basically said, "We who are worth as much as you." So this is an oath from the subjects to the king. "We who are worth as much as you, and who together are worth more than you, we will make you king if you keep our privileges and liberties, and if not, not." So that's the level it reached. Again, it was a sort of a pact, basically saying, if you protect our privileges and liberties, you will be our king, and if not, then not. Um, so it was good until it wasn't, right? When the war started to wane down, a lot of the military came back to the cities, and the military, the soldiers, well, they were they were not particularly professionals or craftsmen, to participate in that economy. So they were quite resentful because they had just fought a war, and they come back to this more liberal society, and they they're not, they felt they were not being compensated. And so that was one. And then you had the nobles. Of course, the nobles were angry about it because the serfs were leaving to the cities, and they were left with this rural land that they couldn't exploit. And so that pressure from the military and the nobles led to an amendment of the municipal regime, which created the regimiento. The regimiento, I've seen some translations to Council of Aldermen, but I'm not so sure it's a proper translation. But anyways, the regimiento. So before you had the open council, which was all the neighbors, the closed council, which were a few, but with the regimiento, you had like a very select few people, usually not more than 10, 5, 6, 7, 8, or up to 10. That was the most regidores that were allowed. Um, so they took control of the municipalities, the municipal regimes in general. They were amended, and they installed the regimiento, and this regimiento was who had representation there was the military, the nobles, and a few of the more economically powerful houses, right? The family houses that had economic power. So essentially, you had nobles, military, and some sort of oligarch or highly economically powerful families. And then they started controlling, the main aspects of the economies, and they also made the how do you call it, it was they made an amendment in which people who were going to be regidores, they had to pay, right, for the position. So they would start selling the position of regidor, which was the council of aldermen, and the military, the nobles, and the economic houses, they had to purchase their way into the municipality. And then those positions became hereditary. So if your father, was a regidor, then you could inherit his position in the municipal government. And of course, this heavily contradicted and made away with the previous more democratic, open and closed council systems of government. And it actually got a little worse because the king then he wanted influence. So you had the regiduría, and they created a corregiduría. So it was supposed to be some sort of executive support to the local government. But the king appointed the corregidor, which essentially became the boss of all of them. And you had the corregidor, which was the representative of the king in each of the municipal governments. And by then, it's quite an oligarchic and absolutist a municipal system. And that's the one that more closed, more autocratic system. That's the one that was imported into America. In 1519, that was the year where the first municipality in America was founded, and it became the main legal tool for the conquest. There was a controversy, regarding the treatment of the indigenous populations of America. And the Catholic kings of Spain, they enacted a series a series of laws that protected the rights of the Indians. Um, they were granted civil rights to own property, to marry, to form contracts, and they created the indigenous municipalities. The laws call it municipios indios, which were specific municipalities exclusively for the indigenous populations. And and this is how it's very interesting, because this system of essentially conquest and exploitation of these indigenous communities actually became the first expression of democratic governance in Latin America, because the Spanish were afraid that if you allowed the indigenous municipalities to sell their positions of government, so for example, if they were starting to sell off the different public positions within the municipal government, the Spanish were afraid that that would empower the indigenous communities too much, because they would make too much money by selling the positions. So they prohibited that. They prohibited the commercialization, of public positions. And and they mandated that the indigenous populations had to go to yearly elections. So those living in the indigenous municipalities went to elections every year, and every year they elected their own councilman to their own municipal government. And they were also allowed to keep some of their customs, including criminal law. And the tribal chiefs were given the power to punish lesser crimes and apply a lot of the norms of that they had in their customs. So that was the origin. And then, by the 19th century, liberalism came to America. It came to Spain with the Constitution of Cadiz. But there started, 19th century is a lot of turmoil, and I'm about to finish the story. But the municipalities became constitutionalized, right? So they were recognized in the Constitution of Cadiz. This is 1812, early 19th century. And the Constitution of Cadiz, that applied to the Spanish kingdom, in the Iberian Peninsula, but also to all of the all the American former Spanish colonies. They by that time it all became a civil government, a constitutional government. However, the liberals they saw in the municipal regime a way for the royalists, the absolutists or conservatives to hold their power. They say in all these autonomous municipalities, there the royalists and the conservatives are going to go hide. So the liberals they removed in the new constitution and the subsequent laws all sorts of autonomy from the municipalities, and they concentrated power into a revolutionary liberal civil government, which was the public administration of the executive power, because they said we had to take power away from the vestiges um, of absolutism, which is represented in the various municipal governments. This led to a lot of debate between the American liberals and the Peninsulan liberals. The Americans, they wanted to keep autonomous municipalities, but the Spanish in Europe, they wanted to centralize everything in the executive, and the centralizers won that battle. They won that battle. However, a lot of instability in Europe led to the collapse of King Ferdinand the Seventh. Because the French invaded Spain, and there was a tumultuous time in Europe. So that led to the collapse of King Ferdinand the Seventh. And so what the American liberals said, and they relied on ancient, legal theories, which are very much contract theory of government. It's actually called the doctrina del pactismo, which is a compact doctrine of compact. They said that when in the event of vacatio regis, when the king is gone, the sovereignty goes back to the people. And they said, well, the municipalities are the representatives of the people. So when King Ferdinand abdicated, all the municipalities became free, of a centralized power, and they led the resistance against the French invasion in a decentralized manner. The French invasion was eventually solved, but I want to finish with this: is that during those subsequent years, all that turmoil led to the Spanish American independence. The independence of all the American former colonies, now nations. They did it through the municipalities. So what I'm trying to say is that when the Spanish peoples um, in Latin America, they went for their independence, they didn't do it through a constituent assembly. So, for example, in Central America and most of the South American states, it wasn't a constituent assembly that said we are now independent of Spain. It was actually each municipal government at a time. So there were broad declarations. In the case of Central America, in Guatemala, in 1821, the Central American provinces, they declared their independence from Spain, but it was not a joint declaration. It was a political one made in Guatemala, and then every single municipality in Central America, they had to ratify the decision because they were all independent. And each of the municipalities had to join into the Declaration of Independence and join into forming a nation state. So yeah, so that's the history, of the Hispanic heritage of free cities, which helped bring about, put an end to the vassalship before the feudal lords, guarantee public freedom, facilitated democratic development in Spain and America, allowed indigenous people to preserve their customs, and it also promoted the independence movement in Latin America. Um, However, the independent nations, they kept the centralized structures, so they sort of rejected this incredible and amazing heritage. And essentially now most of the Latin American nations still have very strong centralized governments, which do not recognize much local autonomy as it happened before, and as is a part of this incredible constitutional heritage.
Thank you so much, Jorge. I think that was quite a fascinating review of history, especially in the colonization. We often, those of us who are from Latin American countries, we often read and study about it in high school. But it's always good to just relearn it and rehear it from different perspectives that maybe take one topic at a time, because it's a gigantic topic. It's very broad. And I'm very glad to see many conversations arising in the group chat. Feel free to keep sending comments, questions. If you have any book recommendations, basically any type of comment that will spawn curiosity, please make sure to add it. Once again, we will be answering the questions at the end. You will have even the possibility to open your microphone and camera, because we want to keep these conversations going. Now, on to our last and final lecture of today. I would like to um, introduce to you guys to Thibault Serlet. To tell you guys a little bit about Thibault, I think those of us who had the pleasure of hearing his lectures will be gladly surprised today to learn about another interesting and fascinating topic, which is, why don't medieval maps have borders? So a little bit about Thibault. Thibault is a co-founder and head of research at the Adrianople Group. He is an expert on special economic zones and is the co-founder of the Startup Societies Foundation, a US-based nonprofit think tank that studies SECs and publishes an academic journal. His research has been published in MarketWatch, Reuters, AP, and Inform Infrastructure, among several others. He's most well known for leading the Open Map initiative to create the world's largest SEC data set. Most of you, I think, already attended our Open Map event, which basically mapped over 5,000 special economic zones throughout the world. I think it's the only and the biggest projects to accomplish this. Thibault is also a prolific writer and research on medieval history. He runs a book review blog where he reviews a history book a week, ranging from primary sources to the 19th century textbook. So, without adding more, Thibault, you have the stand, and please tell us. I think we've been dying to know, why don't medieval maps have borders?
Well, thank you very much, Ivette. So why don't medieval maps have borders? Ask yourself, what did medieval maps look like? Perhaps when imagining medieval maps, you're influenced by the maps of pop culture, such as this map of Middle-earth. But in reality, imagine traveling with this, how impossible it would be. This is an actual, practical travel map from the Middle Ages. And the first thing that's striking is how long it is. It's about 6.75 meters long and 0.3 meters wide. So in terms of length, it's about 3.5 Obamas long in terms of how tall it is. And Obama's a very tall man. He's about 2 meters. So the way that the map works is you scroll the map as you want to travel. Let's look at Rome. A few things are striking. First of all, the map is very compressed. The Mediterranean is almost the same thickness as the Adriatic. And furthermore, the angle of Italy is very different than the angle in which we typically perceive a map. Italy runs parallel to both the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. The other thing that's quite striking is that you can see the cities and the roads very clearly. If you were traveling and using this map, you could follow the signposts and ask peasants, is this road, is this that road? And you could actually go across all of Europe with a map like this. So imagine you're going from Rome. You would scroll, 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 and suddenly you arrive at your destination in Sicily. This map is very practicable, it's very navigable, and its distortions actually help rather than hinder the user. This is the Adrianople map. It was commissioned by Roger of Sicily, and this map is a decorative map. It was never meant to be used to navigate and for practical, and it's much more similar to that Lord of the Rings map. Note that this isn't an original map. It's actually a 1929 replica based off of a damaged 1450s edition. And if you look at the map, the original, it's like this, but all torn up and hard to read, so I'm actually using this replica. And the first thing that's striking is that south is up. The conventions for medieval Islamic map makers are very different than modern. So if you flip it to map modern conventions, suddenly the map becomes recognizable. Here you have Europe, this blob is Arabia, you can see the Nile River in green, and of course the Sicilians who commissioned the map are prominent. Zooming in, what you see are mountain ranges, rivers, and you also can see the cities, which are all of these dots with neatly labeled Arabic points. So let's look at a modern map. There's a few key distinctions. In a modern map, you can see Algeria, you can see Finland, you can see Mongolia, you can see Iraq, you can see Colombia, you can see distinct nation states with distinct national borders. The oldest map that actually has borders was made by Ortelius in the 1570s. And in fact, this Ortelius map is quite recognizable. You can see countries like France, Norway, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, all of the staples of modern day cartography are still present. And once again, states have delineated territories and have clear borders and have clear definite boundaries. So what happens when modern cartographers try to map the medieval world with modern map conventions? This is a map of Europe in 1444. And the closer you look, the more chaotic it becomes. Europe is this indistinct mesh of tiny competing city-states that blur to each other with messy boundaries and geographically non-contiguous areas. In many ways, this is a world where everything is Liechtenstein or everything is Monaco. France barely exists and is a huge mess. The most centralized state on this map is the Ottoman Empire. However, when you zoom into the Ottoman Empire, you start to notice these shields everywhere. These shields represent vassal states. What is a vassal? Well, let's look at the modern world. Belarus is a small Eastern European country located on the borders of modern-day Russia. Belarus has its own president, it's a UN-recognized nation, and yet it is completely politically, economically, and militarily dependent on Russia. It is a Russian puppet state. So even the centralized states like the Ottoman Empire, when you look closely at a medieval map that is done properly with modern conventions of the medieval world, is covered in puppet states. So you can say, wait a minute, let's draw a modern map using these conventions. You can say America couldn't look like this, but if you add in 50 states, it looks like this. And if you add in all of the counties, suddenly you have a map that looks quite medieval. But no, you would be wrong. The US is a nation state and is basically the equivalent of one of these blobs on this medieval map in terms of levels of sovereignty and levels of autonomy. And in fact, many of those little dots on the medieval map are further subdivided into administrative divisions the same way that the United States is. If you want it to be historically accurate, I don't know, maybe you'd add a little Puerto Rican flag to designate Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands as a vassal or something. So let's look at this medieval world and look a little bit at what I mean and what exactly these abstract sort of chaotic mess of city-states on the map actually practically means. Let's look at France, quote unquote. So here's a map of France from 400 years earlier, around 1000 AD. And if you can identify France on a map, it means that you've studied history. Because although the actual land that is France, the broader idea of the nation state, already had some embryonic existence, the actual area that is controlled by the king was the royal domain in blue, which you can see right here. Here's another map also depicting it. And once again, the royal domain are these little blue blobs in the center of France. So how exactly does the royal domain relate to the rest of France? So let's look at France, quote unquote, in 1200. This is the most oversimplified map that I could find. And in fact, obviously the reality is much more decentralized, but I think it's as simple as I can manage in a short presentation like this one. So this is the royal domain in France. Let's chart it out. So there is the king of the Franks. The king of the Franks is the king, not of the territory of France, but of the Frankish ethnic group. And the king of France governs directly royal lands. However, it's a little bit more complicated because royal lands are technically several different small countries which all share the same king as ruler. And this is, broadly speaking, quote unquote, the kingdom of France. Actually, the concept of France will appear a few generations after 1200, but that's a detail. So you have the royal domain in blue. What are some of these other entities? You have le comté de Vermandois, the county of Vermandois, le comté de Champagne, the county of Champagne, and the marquise of Gautier. Let's look at these three. So you have, once again, the county of Vermandois, the county of Champagne, and the marquise of Gautier. So what's their relationship to the kingdom of France? Well, they are sometimes vassals of the king of France. And we'll get into what sometimes means later. What about Brittany? A very distinctly independent French region with a distinct tradition dating back thousands of years and the tastiest food in all of France. Brittany is, like the others, a vassal client state of France, but in 1200, Brittany is actually de facto independent and the king has no effective control. Let's look for a straightforward relationship, where at least there's just a normal vassal without any weirdness. The Duchy of Burgundy. You have the Duchy of Burgundy, and it is a vassal of France. No sometimes vassal, it's very consistently loyal, no de facto independence, nothing is complicated, until you realize there's also a kingdom of Burgundy. You see, looking back at our map, you realize that right next to the Duchy of Burgundy is the Kingdom of Burgundy. And the Kingdom of Burgundy, over the next 300 years, will develop its own feudal network as complicated, as vast as France. And for a brief period in the late 1400s, it would have looked like Burgundy could have taken over all of France and actually have become the main superpower and formed a modern-day nation-state. And the Burgundian system of alliances and feudalism and vassal relationships was as complicated as France, and so it gets its own little box with its own little complicated network. And of course, the Duchy of Burgundy and the Kingdom of Burgundy hate each other and are constantly at war. And what about Vermandois, Champagne, and Gautier? Well, it turns out that these are sometimes vassals of Burgundy. What about Maine Anjou? This one should be fairly simple, right? So Maine Anjou, like a lot of the others, is a vassal of France. However, when you throw in the Duchy of Normandy, things become more complicated. Normandy, right over here, famous for D-Day, famous for being established by Vikings a few hundred years earlier, located to the north of Maine Anjou. You see, Maine Anjou has the Duchy of Normandy as its own vassal, which is simultaneously a vassal of France, not too complicated in these feudal relationships. However, in the mid-11th century, William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, unilaterally went to England and conquered it, claiming it for himself, making the Angevin dynasty the kings of England, which is problematic because England is the traditional rival of France and has been at war with France for a very long time. Why? Because of the Duchy of Aquitaine. Aquitaine on this map is depicted as this big orange blob, when of course, as is many things medieval, the reality is more complicated. So what about Aquitaine? You see, Aquitaine was both a vassal, a personal vassal of the King of France, or the King of the Franks, and a vassal of England at the same time, and thus the source of significant conflict during a period of history now known as the 100 Years' War, which would succeed this very shortly. Now, Aquitaine itself had a claim to be the Duke of Gascony. Gascony is this territory right below. The problem is that Gascony is a vassal of France and things are a little bit more complicated. Gascony is divided, like many of these other entities, into various warring counties, viscounties, and other political entities, an ever-shifting network of city-states within it. And in fact, the Duke of Gascony has only nominal control over what are practically warring different communities led by warlords. And thus, feudalism cannot be seen as this hierarchical caricature. Feudalism is a complicated network of contractual relationships that often seems very complicated. And feudalism is what all of these maps are trying to depict. We have not covered many more entities that appear here. What about Flanders, which has its own very complicated and distinct history? What about the Spanish marches that are being established by the French kings during the Reconquista? What about the Canty of Toulouse, which is about to go through in 1200 this religious rebellion where they break away from Christianity, establish their own Cathar religion, and itself, of course, is this incredible, confusing mess of city-states. By the 1480s, France would establish enough long-lasting vassal relationships that you're starting to get this modern concept of France. And really, over time, the King of the Franks become the King of France, and France in the 1500s finally emerges as a fully formed nation state. And still, by the time of the French Revolution, many of the regions of France still were technically vassal states. So really, state formation in Europe is a process that is slow and takes centuries. Much more famous than France as a mess is the case study of the Holy Roman Empire. I won't go into it in much length, but basically a Frankish warlord, Charlemagne, in 800 AD, attempts to symbolically restore the Roman Empire a few years after it's collapsed. There's actually more continuity, but I don't want to go into too much detail. They create this Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire famously said, it's not holy. It's where the Protestant Reformation started. It's not Roman. It's German, Italian, and maybe a bit French. And it's definitely not an empire. It's whatever this mess is. And of course, like France, the Holy Roman Empire is a very similar situation, the main difference being that the relationships are far more decentralized, fragmented, and significantly more complicated. And this entity would last until Napoleon's conquests in the early 19th century. So is this a world of really primitive feudalism in the sense that we imagine it? There's this famous scene in Monty Python where the peasants are tilling the field and they see the king. And the peasant says, "He a peasant?" And the other peasant says, "No, look, he's not covered in shit like us. He's not one of the peasants." So is this world of the peasants toiling in the soil, the traditional pop culture true? Not at all. Look at the decentralization in Italy before the Renaissance and during the Renaissance. Italy, like France, like the Holy Roman Empire, is this very similar situation. We do not get the modern world from the Romans. We do not get the modern world from the Greeks. We only get the Romans and the Greeks through the medieval world, which incubated and grew on it. This fragmented and decentralized world is the world that we owe everything to. It is a world where Brunelleschi builds the largest dome in history that would be unsurpassed until the early 20th century and modern architecture is inspired from. It's the world where steel frames inside of buildings hold up massive edifices to God. It is a world where art and Impressionism becomes much more realistic, and people finally learn how to depict the world on canvas or in stone in a way that is realistic. It is a world of complex international trade, where trade networks spanning Timbuktu, spanning Kilwa, spanning China, spanning Malaysia, spanning India, and the Abbasid Caliphate are all interconnected in this vast global international network. It is a world where military technology is being transformed and revolutionized, where only a few hundred years later, at the Battle of Lepanto, the Venetians built factories that would inspire Henry Ford, where they mass assemble fleets of warships armed with new gunpowder and fight on an industrial scale. It is a world where everything starts being documented for the first time, where the Florentine city councilors have to record the history of their city-state as part of their state duties, where maps of battles, like Lepanto in the previous slide, are finally depicted, and we know the strategic order. It is a world where merchants are using astrolabes and the science of studying the cosmos to understand how to navigate the seas and travel long distances in what would lead ultimately to the modern GPS system. It is a world where engineers are starting to build clocks so that they can keep track of the time when the sun is not in the sky and no longer relying on sundials. It is a world where mathematics, where arithmetics, where geometry are formalized. It is a world where alchemists are starting to invent the scientific method and systematically experiment with chemistry. It is a world where mechanical devices for industrial applications are becoming more and more widespread. It is a world where Europeans are starting to build massive libraries to hoard knowledge. It is a world where medicine is invented, where bodies are dissected, where disease is understood, where plagues are quarantined, and where human life and welfare starts to improve. This is the world that leads to the exponential growth that allows us to shoot into modernity. Does it mean that city-states are always good? No. But what it means is that we cannot discount the world of the past. The world of the Middle Ages is not a world that is divided, that looks like this, where humanity is separated by artificial lines drawn on maps by dead politicians. It is not a world of borders. It is a world that is borderless, and in many ways is more limitless and mentally unchained than our own. Thank you very much, and I hope that you can dream with me once again that perhaps the future may also have a borderless world.
Thanks, Thibault. Unfortunately, we won't be able to open the microphone as we had suggested before, but I do encourage you to send all your questions on this meeting chat. So now we will be addressing the questions that were addressed both to Heba, Jorge, or Thibault. So either three of you can answer. Feel free to comment on each other. I think all of you are co-hosts now. If not, I'll make you co-host so you can also open your microphone, Heba and Jorge, and you can comment. So let me just get that quickly first. Let me see. So we can start with the questions going. But in the meantime, I think the first question that we have addressed to Heba, it says that Thibault actually addressed a little bit briefly on the chat, is what was the ratio of African pre-colonial city-states between coastal and inland ones? And Thibault mentioned that it depends on the region. So I would like to know, Heba, your follow-up to that.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said. It does depend on the region. There were a lot that were landlocked, and there were.
Heba, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Your audio seems a bit distorted.
I think there's a little bit of echo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I think I'm in the speaker. Can you hear me now, or should I get the headphones?
It's much better.
It's okay.
Okay. And then I think I just need to be closer to the laptop. Yeah, so basically, as Thibault answered, it depends. There was a lot of city-states that were on the trans-Saharan trade routes. So there were a lot of landlocked city-states. There were also a lot of city-states that we seen on the East African coast that were just basically there on the Indian Ocean. So it really depends.
And following up, we have a very interesting question from Preston, especially for you, Heba. Like, what are some of the main factors you've identified that allow these city states to preserve their autonomy in relation to, say, larger kingdoms, empires, etc.?
I think that the main thing that was in common between all of the city-states were their autonomy over their trade and their economic autonomy. And as long as they had this economic autonomy, and as long as they were on a good trade route, or they had good trade relations with other settlements or other countries or nations or whatever you want to call them, they managed pretty much to maintain their autonomy. One other thing is that they had really good urban-rural connections. So once you had a city-state, in a lot of the cases, they had really good communications with the rural areas around them, and they actually were kind of loyal to those city-states. So they were, in a sense, kind of secured, at least their geographical presence. They had the economic autonomy to continue growing and to continue flourishing. So this is basically how they kind of sustain themselves. And one also interesting scenario is that they had somewhat also their like governance systems were somewhat defined, but it wasn't rigid. There were also always like a place for innovation. And if you look, for instance, in the Benin Empire, and you would see that there was always an innovation in governance year after year. So they changed how they approached every city-state that they ranked. They had different approaches to different city-states, and they had different approaches that changed over the years as well. So that kind of non-rigidity in how they governed and how they basically governed themselves was really also a factor in the success of those city-states.
Heba, I'd also like to address this question and reinforce a little bit what you said.
Please
so,
go ahead.
Henry Kissinger, in his book World Order, has a very fascinating theory. And once you read it, you can never sort of unsee it. And he makes the case that how authoritarian and centralized the state is determined by the geography. Let's look at the most authoritarian states in history. Northern China, it's flat. Russia, it's flat. Undefensible. When you cannot defend your territory, Mongol raiders can come at any time and take all of your gold and women and leave. If you look at the places that have historically had libertarianism, right? You look at Switzerland, it's this mountainous region. You look at the Taoists of China. Once again, the Taoists were this very interesting proto-anarchist group in the Middle Ages. Some Taoists were, conversation for another day. They have the Himalayan foothills, they have swamps. If you look at the geography of the Holy Roman Empire, you have this, Germany has these massive forests and so forth. You look at the Berbers of North Africa. So one key thing is that a lot of the geography in Africa does not lend itself to the formation of large states. And large states are very unstable historically. It's no coincidence that whether you're talking about, Timur or Genghis Khan or Napoleon or Hitler, all of these people who sort of forced large empires on hostile geography, their empires always collapse after one generation.
Thanks to you for that comment. Heba, I think that sort of addresses, because that was sort of my follow-up question, like what sort of prevented one city from saying, hey, I want to grow and not only be a city, but sort of become an empire and sort of conquer the other. I think you were talking a little bit about that, governance innovation, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit, because I think Thibault gave a nice explanation as to why weren't there external influence, but what prevented actually one city from deciding to say take over their neighboring city.
So for instance, let's take the example of the East African city-states, right? What prevented, for instance, Kilwa tried, and at its height when it was like super strong, it really actually tried to take over all the other like smaller city-states. And because the city-states were actually really strong, had autonomy, they had really good connections also with different connections and really good connections with the trader that they traded with. The Kilwa couldn't do it, even like it was the highest of its power. It was really politically very stable. It depended on like that kind of balance of power, or kind of the autonomy that the other uh, actually places had. But for instance, in the case of Kumsi, we see that okay, no, it was strong enough. It became a city state, and it turned into one of the greatest empires that sub-Saharan Africa ever had. So it really depended on the context. In certain areas, there were like states had kind of the same power, so not one could take over the others. And in other places, when once the state became so strong, it took the typical route to become a nation state and formed an empire. So I would say, yeah, it depends on the context, but yeah, power relation.
Now, always talking about African city-states. What about the city-states in Africa before the arrival of Islam and the interaction with Arab and Muslim powers?
Yeah, this is it. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, there's a huge problem, and in that most of the historiography is based off of archaeology and not written records. A very interesting thing about the penetration of Islam into the sub-Saharan African region, if you're looking at the history of Islam in West Africa versus the history of Islam in East Africa, it's totally different histories, right? So the penetration of Islam in West Africa is actually it's one of the most decentralized group of Muslims ever. It's a group called the Karjites, who control North Africa for about 300 years. They're basically Berbers who've converted to Islam, and they have this philosophy that is fascinating, and it boils down to kill all the tax collectors because they're rebelling against the Sunnis, and they're the ones who actually go forth. So because of this, it doesn't really cause centralization or affect it that much. And I'll pass it to Heba.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take on it, Thibault. And yeah, I completely agree with you. And one other thing, for instance, one of the biggest kind of Muslim or Islamic city-states, which is Cano, I discussed, it actually started pre-Islam. It started around the end of the 9th century, so before Islam actually entered this region. And then the people adopted Islam, or Islam entered, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's a lot of the some of the city-states, not a lot of them, but some of the states are basically even the entering of Islam in this region.
Thanks, Hema. And we do have a couple of questions, both to George and for Thibault, but the three of you feel free to comment and answer the questions and sort of start this discussion. So about the cities that you were discussing, George, do you think that the cities that had this more autonomy, did they experience maybe faster development in comparison to the rest of the cities?
Well, they were very attractive. So I don't have any like concrete evidence to share with you right now, but just by the names of this city, León, Zaragoza, even Barcelona, these are cities that are known for their cultural and commercial development. Plus, if you have people moving there, then you would presume that these cities are offering better conditions and more economic activity.
And just to clarify, that your lecture was more focused on the influence from the Roman rather than the Moorish and Islamic influence in Spain.
Well, in the case of Spain, by by the height of the Middle Ages, what year 1010, 1014, which is the years where this free cities charters were authorized, those municipal regimes were quite unique, for Spain, and perhaps they were more similar to other, in to other cities or free cities in Europe, but definitely not with the with the Roman municipium, which was mainly used as a tool of conquest, and it would also allow some sort of autonomy to the conquered peoples. So the Spanish free city, it's a free city, it's a charter, it's a compact, it's a treaty or agreement that these peoples reached with the king, and which granted them certain autonomy and privileges and freedoms. However, it was the phenomenon. It's known as oligarchización, or I'm not sure how to translate it, but it's oligarchization of the municipal regime, and that phenomenon is very well studied by historians of Middle Age Spain, and it's even today when you see the law of local governments in Spain, there's a very broad history that accompanies it, and tells you how these free cities were oligarchized, and they sort of lost their purpose and meaning. And then I think that law is from the 90s, but in the 90s they went back to those principles, and they created the city council. And today, the Spanish ayuntamientos, they're quite free. They have a lot of autonomy. But it's very interesting because in Latin America, you never saw that return to the original concept. So Latin America got stuck with the oligarchized version of the Hispanic regime. When you go to Latin America, you see the regidores. It's still the regimiento, mostly, with exceptions. Some countries in South America have city councils, which are way more democratic. Um, so that's like the free city phenomenon. But when during its oligarchic state, that's when it was brought to America for the conquest. And yes, for the Spanish conquest, then that initial Spanish um, municipios or municipalities, those were sort of based on the ancient Roman concept, except that it was mostly for the conquerors to organize themselves and make decisions. And out of that one, then they created a different species, which was the indigenous municipality. They call it Municipio de Indios, and that's the one where it was where you first saw democracy in the Americas, because the indigenous populations had to elect and go to vote for their own leaders, and they administered the property registry. They could get married, they could have property, and all sorts of things. But
and 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 it's speaking of these indigenous municipalities, Alicon mentions that it will be interesting to know how much continuity there was from the extant indigenous municipality philosophy, for example, the Mayan concept of patent, to the regidor system.
well, in terms of the indigenous municipality, what you had in a sense was the Spanish structure. So this is the Spanish laws that allowed for it, and form like the basis, right? But from that basis, the indigenous populations could enact or receive within that framework their ancient customs. So we would have to go into detail between the different, indigenous municipalities, and what these indigenous people origins are, and what are precisely the laws or customs that they incorporated into the indigenous municipality regime. But they did, they had a legislative power, they had ordenanzas, they had a criminal autonomy, and even the tribal chiefs, they were recognized as a sort of criminal judges, and then they could impose a penalties and punishments that were, in accordance with that indigenous community's customs.
All right, thank you so much, Jorge, for clarifying that. And I have a couple of questions and comments for Thibault. First of all, saying that it was very entertaining, and thank you. And what will your response be to the argument that whilst the commercial, the novel, medieval world did provide all of those wonderful achievements, the peasantry has only been able to advance their quality of life through industrialized centralization?
That is a very complicated question. And if you look at the condition of the peasantry in Europe, because it's so decentralized, you have a very wide variety of situations going on. You have a lot of places, like if you look, and keep in mind, right, the Middle Ages is a time that officially stretches from 500 AD to 1500, and a lot of these systems exist in, in Iraq, in England, in Morocco, in Russia, all four quadrants of the world, in Asia to some extent. So in a lot of places, the peasantry did very well under feudalism, and the peasantry's rights was very well protected. However, in a lot of places, there were serious abuses. What happened, the main reason why the system of feudalism did not last wasn't because it was holding the peasants down. It wasn't much more or less oppressive than what came after. It was definitely very oppressive by modern standards. What brought it down is the problem of military defense. Let's look at a modern analogy. The closest modern analogy that I can come up with is global warming. And the reason why is because, or let's look at some climate change issue, right? Like ocean plastic. The ocean cannot really be privatized. And the problem is that the more some countries restrict their use of plastic, the more the remaining countries have an incentive to cheat. So suppose that there's all countries in the world ban coal but one. Well, that one country is going to make so much money because the price of coal will be so cheap that as a result, there's an incentive to cheat. You have this tragedy of the commons. So what happens is that you have a series of very brutal wars starting in the 13th century. And as a result, and this applies to Europe. The Middle East goes through its centralization much earlier. As a result, what happens is that you have the very same sort of tragedy of the commons where the centralized states are able to one by one replace the decentralized states. I don't think it's easy to make a case that decentralization is always positive. I think the case that's easy to make is that just as centralized states vary quite a bit, where you have, I don't know, Switzerland and North Korea that are both kind of like, governments, you basically have the Switzerlands and North Koreas of decentralized states as well.
Thanks, Eva, for that clarification. And the other comment comes from Jay, who is also thanking you. It says, bravo, Professor Thibault, and more evidence to support your characterization of France. When King Philip IV expelled the use from France in the 14th centuries, this did not at first extend to Lorraine or Roussillon for the reason that you touched on. That being said, so we want more decentralized city-state as future fodder for the new Francis, which may emerge thereafter?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah. Jay, if you're listening, you can also rephrase it if it's not clear enough. It says that do we want more decentralized city-states as future fodder for the new Francis, which may emerge thereafter?
I see. Well, I don't know. Okay, next question. I'll let George and Heba answer that one.
Could you repeat, Ivette?
Yeah. Do we want more decentralized city-states as future fodder for the new Francises?
For the new, like, centralized states?
For the new what, sorry?
The point being, do we want to be right back where we are now? That's the rephrasing from Jay.
Well, I just want decentralized government because I think it's the easiest way for people to get what they want. It's harder to get what you want where you're all bundled up with big nation states or big communities. Uh, so that's it's for me. It's just a pretty logic. The more decentralized, the liker it is that as an individual or as a community, you're gonna get what you want from your government and from your self determination. To fulfill your aims and whatever you envision as progress. If you bundle people up too much, then nobody's gonna get what they want. Everybody's gonna be angry. It's gonna be very divisive and very sort of like the uh, disbelief or erosion of democracy or liberal thinking that we're seeing right now. I think that's could be one of the many factors. So definitely we want more decentralization so that we can get what we want.
Yeah, and I think like the main, at least like in my talk, like the main thing about it is like to see how the city did it and how they did things right and how they actually nailed things that up till now we're still trying to kind of solve and trying to talk about in our African countries, and just see how they did it right and just kind of learn from them, right? So there is a lot to learn from the city states, and I think we should continue just learning those lessons.
And to add to this clarification, I think Ali makes a great point, sort of paraphrasing the question. And she's saying that I think what Jay is saying, one decentralizing states lead us right back to where we are now through parties like France taking over bit by bit. I expect the answer has something to do with the fact that we live in different technological times.
Well, I might have a good answer to this. Think of the world as a giant bicycle, and um, so there's of course this saying. I think it's Tacitus who said it, that weak men create hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and the cycle goes over and over. A lot of the ancient scholars and a lot of the ancient theorists, whether you're talking about medieval China or medieval Europe, talk about something called sort of the cyclical theory of history. And probably the most interesting proponent is a 14th century Moroccan, Ibn Khaldun. And what Ibn Khaldun noticed was that the Europeans through the Roman Empire had this great civilization that collapsed and became decentralized. Then the Muslims had their civilization, the Abbasid Empire, which was similar to the Holy Roman Empire, quite interestingly. The Islamic Golden Age is a whole. I thought Ibn Khaldun was Moroccan. Anyways, what happened is that he noticed that the Abbasid Caliphate had its own rise and fall and then passed the baton. What he points out is that when the Islamic world had its beginning of its rise, it did so through a translation movement. They had the Bayat al-Hikman in Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, where they got the texts of the Greeks and translated them into Arabic. They get the texts of the Indians and the Hindus and they translate them into Arabic. They get the Chinese, they get all the civilizations that they come in contact with, and they translate them as part of this translation movement. And what happens is that it's this translation that allows them to combine knowledge. The Indians had the concept of the number zero and the numerical system. The Greeks had the concept of algebra, but had Roman numerals, which were horrible. You combine Roman numerals and you combine the Indian number system, and you get algebras writing in algebra, right? What Ibn Khaldun observes is that his civilization has fallen, and it's now the Italian Renaissance when he's writing. And the Italians, they kick off their Renaissance by having a whole bunch of Arabs that they capture. And as part of treaties, they have a whole bunch of Arabs that are translating all of the text from Arabics into Italian. So he sort of notices the cyclical nature of history. And, maybe to push history forward, we have to pedal.
Thanks, Thibault, for that nice allegory. So now I want to thank all three of you for joining today, for giving amazing talks. And before we wrap up, I would like to hand over the mic to Kat for some closing remarks.
Thanks, everybody. The big thing that I really want to say is we thought that this was going to be a relatively small event, and it turned out to be much bigger than we had anticipated. So thank you all for joining. At the beginning of today's session, we had almost 100 people here. About 100 people registered as well. So it's just amazing to see how many people are interested in this topic. We will definitely have more of these style events with a few more security measures, unfortunately, but definitely have more of these events. We love gathering people together for these types of conversations. Thank you all for showing interest. Thank you to our 3 speakers. Check out the links that are being shared in the chat, where you can follow the Atlas online. You can read about Tangier. If you go to chartercitiesatlas.com, see the really beautiful interactive website that we've put together for you to tell you the story of this self-governing city. And look out next week for a new city to come. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you so much, Kat. And thanks for everybody for joining. Thanks for 3 amazing speakers that we had today. We hope to see you all again in our future events. And as Kat mentioned, please make sure you follow us on social media so you can get the latest updates. With nothing more to add, I just want to wish you all a nice week.